Just a reminder to our Speculating Wildly About Crime listeners, this is for entertainment purposes only and solely the thoughts and opinions of our team. We do invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
Welcome to Speculating Wildly About Crime. I'm Carolina, and I'm going to be your host for this episode. Tonight, we are going to be doing a case that I heard about on a podcast called And That's Why We Drink. One of the hosts, Christine Schieffer, did it. And it's a case that just has really stuck with me, that I've researched, I've kept up to date with. And it's the case of the disappearance and unsolved murder of Dorothy Jane Scott. Has anyone heard of this case before?
I
Ooh.
don't know yet.
David, I'll be looking to you for some speculation at the end of all of this, because
I'm ready.
Saying it right at the top, it is an unsolved case, so there's definitely a lot for us to speculate about. A lot of the theories are all over the place, a lot of different options of what could have possibly happened, unfortunately, to Dorothy. So I'll start at the very beginning. I'll set the scene. Dorothy Jane Scott was born on April 23rd, 1948, to parents Vera and Jacob Scott. She lived in California for a lot of her life. The main events that occur in this case will be from 1980 to 1984 in California. In 1980, Dorothy was 32 years old. She was a single mother to one child. She had a 4-year-old son. I definitely saw some differing reports of the level of relationship that her son's father had with her son. His name was Dennis Terry. He actually lived in Fairgrove, Missouri, so he didn't live close to Dorothy or to Sean, but I definitely read some conflicting information about whether he visited regularly or didn't have much of a relationship. But what we know is that Dorothy and the father were not married and they weren't together. So Dorothy was described by all of her family and friends as very kind and compassionate. She was a giver. She rarely went out. She rarely partied. She was a very hard worker. According to her parents, she had some casual boyfriends, dates, but she really seldom dated. She worked as a secretary at 2 different shops. One was the Swingers Psych Shop, and the other one was Custom John's Head Shop. The Psych Shop was one that sold lava lamps and love beads and knick-knacky things like that. And then the head shop was next door. She was the back-end secretary there. She worked pretty long hours. While she worked, she dropped her son off at her parents' house. Her parents only lived a couple of blocks away from the shops. The shop was located in Anaheim, California. The big events of this case take place in May of 1980. On May 27th of that year, an employee meeting. It was about 9 p.m. So I think it was when the shops were closing up for the day. While at the meeting, Dorothy realized that one of her coworkers, Conrad, had a red mark on his arm. It looked inflamed. She was worried about it. In her personality of just being very kind and compassionate, she asked him about it, and he said he wasn't feeling great, and she insisted that he go get medical attention, even though it was late at night. So he agreed, and she ended up offering to drive him to the hospital. So she drove him to UCI Medical Center. Another coworker, Pam, went along with them. So while Conrad was getting treated at the hospital, Dorothy and Pam just sat in the waiting room. It actually turned out that it was a black widow spider bite that he had. I did look that up because I feel like what you hear about black widow spiders is like they're poisonous, like you're going to...
I thought you just instantly die.
That's what I thought as well. So I looked it up because I was like, how is he still alive and doing all right? Apparently, they are rarely fatal in humans. I have to add in that before they actually went to the hospital, instead of just calling her parents, Dorothy decided, since they only lived a couple of blocks from the shop, she ended up going to check in on her son. Conrad and Pam waited out in the car. She went in and talked to her parents and said, I'm bringing my coworker. I'm afraid he has a medical issue. Can you watch my son a little bit longer while I go to do this? And her parents said, of course. They had a very close relationship with Dorothy and with her son. And while they're at the house, Dorothy changed a bit of what she was wearing from the day at work. She had been wearing a black scarf, and she changed it into a red scarf. I don't know if it was a heavier scarf. Maybe it was cooler out at night, at nighttime. But she changed into a red scarf and put a pin in that because that will come back later and be important. So back to the hospital, Conrad ended up getting treated for the Black Widow spider bite. They did give him some antibiotics or medication or something for it. So while Conrad and Pam waited for the medication, I guess there was a pharmacy where he could pick it up that was right there in the hospital or right next door to the hospital. They waited to go pick up the medication. Dorothy offered to go get her car, which was a white, I think, 1973 Toyota station wagon. So a bigger car, but she had parked it in the parking garage or the parking lot of the hospital. And instead of having Pam and Conrad go with her, she just offered to go get the car and bring it around front to pick them up. So she went out to go get the car. Conrad and Pam ended up getting the medication that he needed, and they went outside to wait for Dorothy's car to come and pick them up. They didn't see her at all, so they waited a little bit, and then they were, oh, she probably should be here by now. So they started walking in the direction of the parking lot where they had parked the car. As they're walking towards the parking lot, they see what they report as being Dorothy's 1973 white Toyota station wagon driving. It's late out at night. It's probably about 11:30 now after he was treated. They saw the car and they figured, oh, here she is. She's here to pick us up. Pam said that she was waving her hands so Dorothy could see her. And the car just sped up and was driving erratically away from them. So they started to follow the car thinking, oh, maybe she didn't see us, but it was hard to believe that she didn't because they were waving their hands and everything. And they started to follow the car a little bit, and it took a right and it sped up down the road. They're like, what's going on? At first they thought maybe she just had some emergency. Maybe she ended up talking to her parents at the hospital. So they went back into the hospital and they ended up waiting for about 2 hours for her to return to the hospital. Again, I feel like trying to put myself in the mindset when I was reading that and hearing about that, I was like, that's like, they're just waiting in the hospital and like basically the middle of the night for 2 hours, but like, they don't have cell phones. They have no easy way to get in touch with Dorothy. So they waited around. And then when about 2 hours passed, they decide to use, I think, either a payphone or the hospital phone to call Dorothy's parents to ask if she had come home or she was there. They talked to the parents and the parents said, nope, they hadn't seen her at all. So at this point, Dorothy's parents and Pam and Conrad all grew concerned. So at that point, they did put a call into the police. And the police at that time didn't take it too seriously. She hadn't been gone for that long. So they didn't really send anybody out at that time. It wasn't until early the next morning. So I think it was around about 4:30. That's when the alarm bells really started to go off, because about 10 miles from the hospital off a road I think it's about an 18-mile stretch of road, the Santa Ana Alley Highway, Dorothy's car was found and it was engulfed in flames. They ended up identifying it as being Dorothy's car. She was not inside the car at that time, but that's when they really started investigating this as a disappearance. Does anyone have any thoughts at this point? I know that was a lot of information to throw out there.
I do remember this case now, though, especially with the changing of the scarf. I remember it now.
Yeah, that's a very key point that definitely comes back into play.
I do have a lot of thoughts, but I feel like it's almost too soon to say them
Okay.
because they're very speculating.
Yes. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think we're definitely going to get to that. There's
I'm biting my nails. Like I'm ready.
one. So bringing this back a little bit, because there were some things going on in Dorothy's life leading up to this night, leading up to May 27th, 1980. Dorothy had been receiving a series of pretty consistent calls, both at where she was working and at her home. She was living with her aunt in Stanton, California. She had been receiving pretty consistent calls from an individual. She believed it was a male. I did see in some blog posts and on Reddit and other sources that she said that she recognized the caller that was calling her, the voice, but couldn't quite place it. But the calls were pretty aggressive. They would go from the caller professing their love for Dorothy and threatening to harm her. So they were very up and down, the calls. One incident that really scared Dorothy, she got a call and the caller told her to go outside because he had left her a present. She did, and she found a single dead rose on the windshield of her car outside. So to me, that just hearing that and reading that is just so terrifying, because he or this person was right there at her house. And then did he go to a payphone to call her and tell her that?
Did he buy a dead rose, or did he buy a rose and then wait for it to die? So how long was this being planned?
Yeah, that's also a very good question.
Was any of this ever reported?
No, not anything that I found that it was reported. She definitely talked to her family about the caller, but at this time, which I may get a little bit up on a soapbox here, but it was 1980. There were no anti-stalking laws at all in place. So I don't know if it was she felt like, even if I call the police, what are they going to do? I don't know who this person is. I haven't had any physical contact with them. So I don't know if that played into it at all, but nothing that I found indicated that she had told the police about this at all. On that note, the first stalking laws actually were in California, but it wasn't until about 10 years after.
And two, like, when I think of true crime, even today, I think that, okay, how long has this person been quote unquote missing? Is the cops going to take this serious? Is it a minority? There's all these things that play. And so when you think about the 80s, and it pisses me off, but when women would say, I feel threatened, the response is, have they done anything yet? And it's still that same response today. Until you murder me, I can't report this person. And then when you murder me, I can't report this person. So I lose either way. What do I do? Did I sweat a little? I'm so mad at that.
Yeah. That aspect of this case is just so frustrating and terrible, because I think there just was no real recourse for her to tell anybody about this.
And to your point, though, David, even just the reporting her missing was like, oh, she doesn't act like this. She can go missing if she wants. Call me when something bad happens. And then her car is engulfed in flames 12 less hours later.
Her body went in it, so she did that to escape. She didn't want to be a single mom anymore. She didn't want to raise a child. There's always something other than someone's missing. Go there first.
And I don't know about you guys, but there's people in my life where I know that you didn't text me that you got home. Clearly, you are dead in a ditch somewhere. I need to call the police now because you always text me that you made it home safe. And there's people where I'm like, oh, I haven't heard from them in 4 days since I left my house. You just know your friends and family that it's like, if my mom doesn't text me she got home, 911 is on speed dial.
It's too. It was so out of personality that she lived a life that was very routine of going to work and caring for her son. She offered to drive her coworker to get medical treatment. She's not going to now decide that this is the time. It just makes no sense that the alarm bells weren't going off sooner when she hadn't been seen in like hours, when she was like, oh, I'm going to get the car, and then she hasn't been seen again. So with the calls, they began to escalate as well. Her parents, she told her parents about one call that she received actually right before she disappeared that really scared her. The caller calls, and I'm going to read the exact quote as relayed by her parents. The caller said, okay, now you are going to come my way, and when I get you alone, I will cut you up into bits so no one will ever find you. I just can't even imagine what she was feeling with that call, because it's just also just such an escalation. I read articles and reports that she had been debating on buying a gun to protect herself, but she was afraid that her son, who was 4 years old, if he got a hold of it, that he would hurt himself with it. So she ended up deciding to take some karate lessons, and she had just started those in May, right before she disappeared. But the calls were scaring her so much that she wanted to take those steps.
Do you know the time span that, like, how long this went on, the calls and the harassment before she disappeared?
So I definitely think it was for a fair period of time. I didn't find anything that was definitive that said it went on for 3 years or anything, because I think most of the reports about the calls come from her parents after she disappeared. But I think that it went on for at least a few months before she disappeared. David, do you know, because I know you know this case, did you read anything?
No, I don't know of a time frame, but I know that it was long enough to be a thing.
I can't even imagine. That's what Dorothy was dealing with in at least the months leading up to her disappearance. When the police first found her car engulfed in flames and were starting to investigate this actually as a disappearance, they asked Dorothy's parents, Vera and Jacob, to keep the story out of the press, to not go to the media about it, and to let them begin their investigation. The parents agreed. They wanted to cooperate with the case and with the investigation, so they didn't go to the press at all. So this case really, at the very beginning parts of it, was not in the press. So about a week after Dorothy's disappearance, her parents received a call to their house. Vera, Dorothy's mother, answered the phone, and when she answered, the caller asked her, "Are you related to Dorothy Scott?" She answered yes, and the caller responded, "I've got her," and hung up the phone. So obviously they were terrified about it. They received another call from the same caller with similar statements. At that point, they decided, it was about 2 weeks after her disappearance, they felt like they had waited long enough, and they decided to go to the media. They wanted to get it out there. They wanted to see if anybody had any information about anything that was going on. So they called a local paper, which was the Register in Santa Ana, and they ran a story about Dorothy's disappearance. The day that the story ran, the managing editor of that paper was sitting at his desk, and he received a call from somebody, an anonymous caller. He said it was a man. During that call, the caller indicated that he had kidnapped Dorothy and that he was responsible for it. 2 times during the call, he indicated that he had killed her. The editor, Pat Riley, believed that the caller was genuinely telling the truth because he was able to say certain details that were not in the story that had ran for the newspaper. The story had only very basic details, whereas this caller knew details that Conrad was treated for a spider bite and details that, again, I said to put a pin in it, that Dorothy was wearing a red scarf on that night, which she just changed the scarf. If you remember, she was at work, stopped by to check on her son and changed her scarf. So she only was wearing the scarf from leaving her parents' house to the hospital. The caller, again, I'll give a direct quote of what the caller said to the managing editor. He indicated to him, quote, "She was my love. I caught her cheating with another man. She denied having someone else. I killed her," end quote. The calls did continue to the parents on a very consistent basis. They believed it was the same caller calling them. They also believed, which I don't think that they knew the voice of the caller that was calling Dorothy, but they believed it was the same person that had been calling Dorothy and harassing Dorothy. They also gave the parents the same details that they gave the reporter, including what she was wearing that night, which made them believe that it was somebody that maybe came upon her the night that she was at the hospital. But yes, you are right, David. They called pretty consistently, usually only when Vera was home. I did hear on a couple of reports that the calls occurred every Wednesday, but I know that they were very consistent calls, which to me, when I was thinking about that, if it is the same person that was calling Dorothy, are they now also stalking her parents?
Yeah.
Knowing when Vera's home, when Vera, the mother, is going to answer the call. And there was one incident where Jacob, the father, answered the call for who we believe was the caller. And I saw some conflicting reports of what they exactly said to Jacob, but pretty consistently I saw that it was, I have the wrong number, and hung up the phone very quickly. And then the call stopped.
Yeah, to me, it was like, I don't know how to respond to a man.
Mm-hmm.
When I think of the whole stalker theory, if the stalking obviously began before Dorothy disappeared, then they already had started tracking the mother as a stay-at-home mother. The father works 9 to 5. The son is dropped off at this time. And to me, it goes back to that whole thing that we always hear of the guilty parties usually try to bring themselves back to the scene of the crime to know what's going on. And so for him to already know all of their patterns and to call them at certain times, it's almost putting yourself back to that scene of the crime, is what I think.
And who is the father of her kid? Like, is he in the picture? Or
the father of her child was somebody by the name of Dennis Terry. He did not live in California. He lived in Fairgrove, Missouri. So I did read some conflicting information about the relationship that he had, but I definitely saw some reports that he did visit with Dorothy and the son on occasion, but they weren't together, and they definitely didn't have a consistent co-parenting relationship. It doesn't seem anyway.
But she spoke with the caller. She would have known, okay, Dennis, fun, good one.
Yeah, I feel like if it was him that was doing these calls, she probably would recognize his voice, especially with how consistent the calls were, that she would probably be able to identify. Would be my thought anyway. Because I think like for a call, maybe you could disguise your voice enough. But if you're calling and saying all of these things to her, I think she probably would be able to pinpoint his voice.
It's also wild to me that if Dorothy had a fairly routine, was doing the same fairly consistent things, he's been stalking her for an extended period of time, presumably. And then the one night where she breaks this routine, takes her coworker to the hospital, is the same night that he takes her. Presumably he takes her. That, you think leaving a rose in front of our house is bold. To me, the one night when you break a routine with two other people that are expecting you in 2 minutes, that's wild to me.
What if he just saw the opportunity? Like, she's walking back to her car, it's an empty parking lot. Like, it's just, maybe it was opportunity. Now was the time because she broke the routine.
Well, and she stopped at her house first, so.
The other thing I wanted to bring up was just, I think we're all on the same page that this was definitely a stalking situation, and he was obviously following her and all of that. It makes me go, what if when there was that call that went back and that he said that was my love, because he's got this false reality that this is his love, right? So he's sitting there, that's my love. But then after that, he goes, but she cheated on me, or I caught her with another man. What if the other man is just the dude she worked with, like the coworker? When you said that, I was like, shit, what if it wasn't even anything? Like, she was all of a sudden paying attention to this guy because she was getting him to the hospital. And what if that's the reason he decided that night that she needed to die, because she was cheating on him when she was just helping out this,
Edit all of that out, because that was my speculation.
You know what? Great minds, David. Great minds.
And great editors.
So I just wonder, at no point in time for all of these calls, whether it was Dorothy or her parents, nobody ever reached out to the phone company, or surely you could have gotten something.
So on that point with Dorothy's parents, when they started receiving those very consistent calls, which the calls that they were receiving went on for years to their house, years, like 3.5 to 4 years, these calls were happening. So they did attempt to do a tapping of the phone. Obviously, if this case were to have happened now, in 2023, there's caller ID, there's easy ways to pinpoint and triangulate where calls are coming from and figure out location and all of that. They didn't have that level of technology, but they did attempt to tap those phone calls and record them. But what I read about that was the caller never stayed on long enough for them to actually utilize any of that data. So whether that was somebody that had the knowledge of that, not, is a speculation that they would know that it couldn't be tracked.
That happened after father answered the phone, right? Is that when they started doing that? I can't remember. Is that when they started doing?
No, I think it was before because the call stopped after the father answered the phone, at least.
Oh, you're right. So before the father, because I was going to say maybe the father answering the phone was what snapped them into.
That is so odd.
Something is, he sounds like the type of guy that hates women, but is scared of other men. Or, yeah, I'm going to definitely say that he hates women. But yeah, either respectful of other men or scared of other men. The type that pretend that they're tough, but honestly are just big wusses.
Maybe in some way by a male figure. Yeah. Because if we're going with the speculation and the theory that this person that was calling was attempting to do it only when Vera was home or when they knew Vera was going to answer the phone, because it seems obviously pretty consistent that she was the one always answering the phone, that maybe they're just intimidated by.
To play the other side of Missy's comment, though, is I don't know that it's a hate for women. I think there is a fear and abuse by a man, and in this victim's mind, they are wanting to protect children. And when they see that her child, who is in a single home family, is being taken to grandparents this day and whatever, and then all of a sudden mom has something better to do than to be with a child on the routine, then there's that attack of, I think that this person has a lot of abuse from a father, and I think that they are considering the mother's sacrifices as abuse, and it's causing hate toward those situations, and that was a trigger for him.
Interesting thought.
That's an interesting perspective on it. I didn't really think about that.
I had a completely far off thought, and since Jamie's not here, I have to say it for her. You know what I mean?
Oh boy.
Oh boy. There, Jamie. I shouted out Jamie today. What if it's somebody that the dad knows? And so a dad answered the phone, dad would recognize the voice, and all of a sudden, oh, wrong number. What if it's somebody that knew of her via dad?
So that is an interesting theory, and one that is shared if you want to go down a Reddit rabbit.
Really?
Yes.
I wasn't even on Reddit.
Yes. So there's definitely a lot of that speculation of the fact that the father may have recognized the voice of the caller. And fact that might make that even more plausible. In my Reddit and blog deep dives of this case, if it's somebody that was interacting with Dorothy at work, which obviously if they're calling her while she's at work, they know her hours, they know she's at work, they know where she works. It could be somebody that was in the shop sometimes, either potentially a janitorial staff or a customer or something that maybe they were afraid the dad would recognize that voice.
See, I was going with a customer. That's how she vaguely knew the voice but couldn't place it.
The calls stopped to Dorothy's parents that had been going on for over 3 years when Jacob, the father, answered the phone. And I think there's a lot to speculate of why that happened. So 4 years after Dorothy's disappearance, on August 6th, 1984, there was a construction worker that was working at a construction site, which was off Santa Ana Canyon Road. It was in Northeast Anaheim, which was about 13 miles from the hospital where Dorothy went missing from. He was preparing the land to lay cables underneath, and he had his bulldozer in there, and he came upon some bones that he found there. So he immediately stopped work, called the police. They responded, and they ended up finding a skull, a pelvis, an arm bone, and 2 femur or thigh bones. I will tell everyone now, it was identified actually fairly quickly, because I think the bones were identified on August 12th, which was only a short time after they were found, as belonging to Dorothy. The way they identified the bones was through a forensic odontologist that was actually on retainer at the coroner's office, which I found interesting. I don't know if that's a typical practice now, but probably at that time, dental records were a way to really identify unidentified people, because there wasn't the level of DNA that we have now. So Dorothy was identified by her dental records. Also found at the site was a turquoise ring and a wristwatch. I saw a lot of reports, but I wasn't able to fully confirm this, that the wristwatch had stopped time at 12:30 a.m. on the night of May 28th. So to me, that makes me think that the watch had to have a date feature on it as well, which I think was more typical in watch. I don't think you see that as much anymore in watches, but I did read that's when it stopped. So if that is true and that's what happened, it was probably only an hour and a half after Dorothy left the hospital is when the watch stopped. Also found at the site were, and all of this is just a trigger warning, but they also found dog bones at the site, which at the time they could be connected, they could not be connected. From what I read about this site, it was a pretty kind of remote area. There weren't buildings there. They only really came upon it because they were working on preparing it for construction there. So this could have been a dog that was a stray dog and ended up dying on that area of the road, and the bones were there. It could have been a dog whose bones were brought in by another animal. So really, they could be connected or not connected, but that's all that was found at the site.
So when they're bulldozing, the disturbing of the earth could also transfer a roadkill situation to the same area, just ironically, right?
That's definitely possible. I think from what I was reading, at least from the news sources that I was reading, it sounds like they didn't do much of the actual bulldozing or constructing before the bones were found. But definitely at the time, the police had said that even Dorothy's bones could have been brought in by an animal. They said that they weren't really buried at the site. Like it wasn't looked like it was, they were intentionally buried, but there was dirt on top of them, but that could have happened from just natural erosion of the area. So
I guess I was thinking in my mind that the bulldozing company people were like, you've got to dig 10 feet in this mile radius, and all of a sudden there's bones. So we knew it was in a 10 feet radius, but that's not the case. It could have been just laying there.
That's what I understood it to be. It wasn't like an intentional, for lack of a better terminology, a grave. It wasn't something that was like 10 feet down. There was definitely dirt that maybe it would have been obscured, but not buried intentionally, is at least what the police felt at the time.
Do you know how the bones were found? Was it in like the shape of how you would lay a person down, or were they?
So I didn't see anything specific about that. So I don't think that they were laid in any type of specific manner. Like like you were saying, like somebody just was, a body was there.
Yeah.
I didn't see anything saying that it looked like they had not ever been disturbed in any way. I think that they had to do some searching to find all of them. I'm thinking they weren't all in the same location of that area, and not all of her skeletal remains were there either.
Honestly, to Janelle's point with that is the prank calls where I'm going to cut you up and I'm going to scatter you where no one finds you. So I had the same question: is how was the skeletal remains found? Were they chopped up? Was it a femur and a big toe? Where they're scattering, you know what I mean? Where there's that separation. That's what I had that same thought.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting thought, especially given the call that she received. At the time, they couldn't identify the cause of death just due to the remains. What they found was not even all of her skeletal remains. So it was the skull, a pelvis, an arm, and 2 thigh bones that were found. And an interesting fact with it, at the time when the police found the bones, they were charred and looked like they had some fire damage to them. So there had been a fire in that area in 1982. The police at the time had surmised that the bones had to have been there at least from 1982. So at least 2 years when they found them. Now they could have been there from 1980 because there wasn't seemingly a lot of traffic in this area where they would have potentially been found before this. But they surmise that they probably were there at least at the time there was the fire.
But the car was also torched, right?
Mhm.
The car had been torched, and forgive me, but that's when they realized that a body isn't burning like you think it would, and they're transporting the body somewhere else outside of the car because it wasn't serving, the fire wasn't serving the purpose.
I would think it would take a long time for the fire to get down to the bone, right?
Fire has to be super duper hot to burn a body. Super hot. Crematoriums are like really freaking hot. And I think that if you're in a fire, like a car fire, it's going to take longer than you think it is.
Yeah.
Well, that's kind of my point, right?
It's not as quick as you think.
Longer. So they're like, oh, we got to get this body out of here. So it's charred because they've moved the body because it's not doing what they thought it was going to do of just, I've got a piece of paper on fire and now it's ashes.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Interesting. But they'd have to be sitting there watching our burn on the side of the road. I guess be a lot of traffic at it's the middle of the night at this time, but they'd have
that would be something that would be easy-ish to cover up. If someone pulled up and was like, you're just watching this fire burn, like you've obviously caused it, versus no, I just walked up on this, I don't know what to do. They could have played dumb. But there are a lot of people that do not leave the scene of the crime. And this is the 80s when there's not, now we know, get in and get out because there's alarms, there's cameras. But then it was like, I can probably get away with that.
So that makes me think about something else. So to get away from the scene of this car fire, like he would have either had to have somebody pick him up or walk. Was it walking distance?
That's a great question.
That is a really good question. I think the area that it was in, it was about 10 miles from the hospital. So I don't know how populated at the time that area was, but I agree that if he's torching the car, if the person that took Dorothy is the same person that is torching this car, then they would have to have some means to get away at that point.
What if he lives super close to wherever the car was torched?
That's why I was wondering if is it in the city? Is this in a different area? Because if you're going to set a car on fire in the middle of downtown, I don't know if that's the best plan. I would think a remote area, but then also like, how do I get out of here?
Mm-hmm.
I also feel like, again, the time frame this happened, we're not calling it Uber. We don't have all the camera stuff. If in the 80s, if I did something like this, absolutely, I could walk a mile or two. I could take a nap in the woods. You know what I mean? Who's going to know? And then walk another mile or two. It's
okay, but David,
out of being out of sight, out of mind.
Now I'm thinking about it. He probably, did he carry her?
I think, I don't
remember, he had to get to the hospital first, right? So did he drive to the hospital? Did he get dropped off at the hospital? So he's got it. Presumably, he's got a car at the hospital.
True.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
maybe he circled back at some point through her. I don't know. Unless there's two people.
I'm going with his house is close to wherever he ditched the car.
Yeah.
That's what I'm going with. I'm going with he fucking stalked her to the hospital, abducted her probably brought her back to his house, killed her there, took her car to wherever, set it on fire, walked back to his house, and then
Can
somehow
I
got-
throw something totally off the wall out there, though?
That's what we do.
Okay, great. Stick
Yeah.
with me. I won't be on my island all by myself, and I'm okay with that.
Jamie is here in spirit.
He drives to the hospital as he's stalking her. And when she goes out to her car, he pulls up, throws her in his trunk, goes park somewhere, takes her car, ditches it somewhere, 10, 13 miles, whatever it is, down, torches it at some point. So we don't even necessarily know when she physically left the parking lot of the hospital. It could have been at that time, or if she was detained somewhere else.
That's very interesting, Dana. Because it's so hard because it doesn't really, with the level of David saying we don't have Uber, there's not like somebody that you can just call and have you pick them up. Going 10, 13 miles from a location is a lot. That is an interesting thing, that if they're focusing on her car, he could have put her in his own car in the parking lot.
And I'm pretty sure in the 80s, they didn't have the pull tab things from the inside. I'm pretty sure that came much later.
Oh, yeah.
And if she was, I'm so sorry, but if she was detained, tied up,
In the trunk of his car the whole time until he got to her. Oh.
Can I give my speculation now that Missy and Dana's pretty much speculated my speculation?
we're stealing your thunder,
It's good
David.
line. It's just good line.
Here's what I think. I think there was this guy, and you might, Carolina, you might be hitting on this, and I might be jumping the gun. But there was this guy that worked for the father when the father owned the businesses. And he knew of Dorothy. I think there was a bit of an infatuation. This was also a troubled person. I want to mention that. But then outside of that, who it might still be him, but I think that someone from work, customer, whatever, was stalking. I think what happened is she pulls up. He's already mad because it's a little bit off kilter from her normal schedule because of the meeting. Then she pulls up and he sees a man in a car.
Mhm.
She runs inside. The man stays in the car. She runs inside. She changes clothes. She comes out. To that psychotic mind of, you're cheating on me. They're thinking, you've gotten dressed up, you've gotten cute, you're going to go party. They follow. She comes out and that person grabs her. I think that is what happened. And because of these stalking traits, he knew mother's schedule, and what threw him off kilter was when father answered the phone. And
once Dorothy's remains were found and identified to be her, and that went to the newspaper, the parents, Vera and Jacob, received 2 more calls from who they believe was the same caller. And the calls asked, "Is Dorothy home?" is what they asked when they called, which is just so creepy and so heart-wrenching, because obviously it's out there. It's somebody that is following this case and knows that's out there, and they're going to call the parents and ask those questions.
I
It's
just
just,
realize how easy it is to follow cases now, but then it's newspaper or stalking. And I do think that there became an obsession with mother, because now that Dorothy is gone, this killer stalker needed a place to put those feelings. And what is the next closest person? Which would be the mother. I feel as if if Dorothy had a daughter versus a son, that would have been the target. And I think that mother became the target.
Was the rest of her ever recovered?
No. So those are the only skeletal remains they have ever found of her.
And there could be a chance that the caller is just a wackadoo and it isn't the killer, but he was just like, hey, I can cause trauma to this family. And maybe he is a customer of the dad's or something like that and never thought to kill her, but was obsessed with her in another way. That, I don't know, it's probably the killer, but there's still some weirdos out there.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think that's definitely a plausible theory because there is no identification of anyone. There's no suspect arrested for actually her murder, and no one knows who was making those calls to her either. And I think on that point, I kept back to the fact that the caller, when he was calling the mother and called the newspaper, that they knew about the red scarf and about the spider bite. And I think both of those are very interesting because the red scarf, it would had to have been somebody that saw her that night. If that's the stalker and not the killer, the stalker was stalking her at the hospital, which is very plausible that they did that. They followed her from her work home. Maybe that's something that they did every day if they're stalking her, and then saw, oh, she's leaving now, and followed her to the hospital and saw that she had changed her scarf. But the interesting point is that they knew about Conrad's spider bite.
I'm going to channel Jamie one more time here. Could the cops have leaked something and just made an offhanded comment to his wife when he went home, who then told her girlfriend at church, who then, we got to throw corrupt cops in there. Otherwise, what are we doing?
But back in the 80s too, he probably could have, once they went into the hospital, her and her friends, but they could have came back inside and said, hey, what was up with that guy? What happened to him? And back in the 80s, they might have just said, oh yeah, he had a spider bite, he's fine.
But,
could have been
but think about this though. This did not all happen in one day, right? Like the prank calls, the information given from the prank calls, it didn't all happen in one day. That was the same day she disappeared. It transpired. If you have a stalker who is putting themselves in, keeping themselves in the scene of the crime, they're going to continue to go to these shops. What are these co-workers going to be talking about? They're going to be talking about the girl that has disappeared that worked for them. How easy would it be to ask a question of, hey, I heard on the news that you're a marketing or accounting person, like disappeared. What happened? Do you know anything? And they gather information that way. And they're like, all we know is they took Benjamin John to the ER that got a shot in the butt. And then all of a sudden this person has this information that not everyone would know, but is used in a prank call.
So I have another wild thing. Not Israel Keys, but this was around the same time as the Golden State Killer, who was a police officer, who did stalking, who made phone calls to his victims before and after he's attacked them.
And solved. All right, that was
There
it,
you go.
everybody. Thank you for listening to today's. What?
Where's the gavel when you need it?
I mean, he wasn't, I think he was right around that same time. I don't think he was in the same.
But his deal was home invasions, right?
Yes.
Yeah, the Golden State Killer.
The difference with this, but it does feel very, and that's definitely a theory that is going around on Reddit boards and blogs and things like that and other podcasts.
The Golden State Killer?
Because of that taunting aspect, it's a very much the Golden State Killer's MO. But
maybe that was the night he was gonna attack her and she drove off.
Where was he that night? We need to now go look that up.
And also, did the Golden State ever cars at all? Like vehicles? No, because he didn't. kidnap people, right? From like their
He,
vehicle.
he always rode his bike a lot of the time.
I feel like it was a stalker that had a plan and where she was very scheduled and calculated, and there was a man seen in her car. If you were a stalker and you're thinking, you're my wife, we belong together, and there's a man in your car, regardless of how innocent or whatever it is, in your mind is you're cheating on me.
You're not even rational. You're not rational at this point.
And you just took off that black scarf and put on a red one.
And a red is a trigger color for people who don't even realize they have triggers, right? Red is associated with anger and certain sexual things. Maybe that played a factor. I think there was a plan this whole time. I don't think the plan was murder. The man in the car, the leaving your child, abandonment issues, and there in that victim mindset, you're abandoning. So I think there was a bunch of triggers that happened that led to
mommy issues. Sounds like mommy issues of some sort.
Oh, 100.
Got some mommy issues, yeah. Because he's attracted to this woman who now is, like you're saying, abandoning her child to go be with another man, but she's not actually being with another man. She's dropping him off at the hospital. But if you're not rational at any point here at all, and then now everything that she does, now she's bringing up that trigger for him, and now she's cheating on him, and even though they don't even have a relationship, it just sounds.
I think you're right, because who knows how long the stalking happened, right? Maybe there was that I don't need to hurt you because you're coming to your child every day, and that's what I wanted my mother to do. But then this one night you didn't, and it triggered me, and you'll pay for it.
Do we know if the son went to go live with his dad after this happened, or if he stayed living with his grandparents?
He stayed living with the grandparents after.
So the mommy issues then could transfer to grandma.
Yes.
Okay.
The child did. I did read that a couple of Dorothy's friends had offered to adopt the child and care for him, but the grandparents wanted to continue to care for him. They obviously had a very close relationship. So yeah, I didn't read anything that he went to go live with the father. And I will say, on the point of the father, they did look to him obviously as a suspect at the time, but he had a pretty airtight alibi. He was in Missouri at the time. I did read in one article that he had actually called Dorothy's parents' house like the day that she had been kidnapped, and the dad called him back later and had spoken to him. So his alibi was pretty airtight that he was many states away when this happened.
And again, like from what I could tell, their relationship, they may not have been besties, and he may not have been an active father, but there wasn't animosity. There wasn't any hate. It wasn't, I'm in love with you, you're not in love with me. It's, we made a baby, you're a woman, you keep the baby, and I'm just going to go live over here. Not that that's right, but you're not a killer because of that.
Yeah. When the shops were run by Dorothy's dad, were they the same establishments?
I think so. At least that's what I've seen. I did read that, Dorothy's parents knew pretty much everyone that worked there and never really considered any of them as potentially being involved. But that's what I saw, at least in my search.
Wasn't there that one guy that worked for the family and then didn't, but then started working for the new owners or something?
The big person that comes up, and I guess this could be the time where I'll say the main theories that I have found. Most of this has happened now on the back end of bloggers and on Reddit, where people are considering all of these options. But there's one name that has come up fairly consistently, and that is a person by the name of Mike Butler. And I don't know if that might be who you're thinking of, David, because I did read in one source that he might have worked in a building next door or like around that area, and that his sister potentially worked with Dorothy. So Mike Butler, he passed away, I think, in 2014. but he was an individual that was described as like a mountain man, lived not off the grid, but more in the country. He was in the military for a period of time, but then came back to this area. I did read in a couple of sources that his sister, who I could not find her name when I was looking through sources, but that she worked with Dorothy at the shop that she was working at. There was also some speculation, and I will put this out there that this is pure speculation that I found online, that he could have potentially been into the occults and all of that, which people I have seen try to tie the fact that Dorothy's body and her skeletal remains was found with dog bones as being a potential connection to this individual. I don't know if I fully buy into that theory. It's definitely an interesting point, but I don't know if I fully buy into that. But he's a name that comes up quite a bit in talking about this case, that as being a potential suspect. So I don't know if the police were ever considering him a suspect. I didn't find anything that actually confirmed that, but there were some thoughts that he could be involved. The other kind of speculation that goes around a lot is, we already talked about it, is the Golden State Killer as being another option.
Cindy.
So we talked about that one, which I think because of haunting phone calls, it felt very much like the Golden State Killer. And even though it didn't necessarily fit in his full mold of what his MO of what he did, it was similar enough. That theory is definitely out there.
Ask you, with the Golden State Killer, were the prank calls already public by the time that this case happened, which would make it almost an idea of a copycat, like, this is him, I'm going to do this too, this is cool?
He called even like within the last few years, some of his victims. So he's been calling them. I don't know if he called before, but he definitely
was it public? Could this killer have heard the Golden State Killer? Was that like hot topic at the moment where they were?
Actually, when did he get his name?
Yeah, it was regional. So there were, he had 3 different names. He was
That's right.
he was Ear, he was Night Stalker, I think, or the original Night Stalker. There was a few names. He didn't get Golden State Killer actually until that was Michelle McNamara that gave him.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I don't know. And I want to say he started in 78 and went through 82 or something like that.
So it makes me wonder, like, when was the prank calls public knowledge to someone, for someone else who was like, I've got this inspiration to kill, to think, I like that idea, like that inspired them to, I'm going to prank call them too. That's really cool. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And you never know, though. He could be the caller, but not the killer. Because he's goofy like that too.
Oh, Cindy.
That's enough.
I was gonna say, and now is there a podcast I can listen to about that, Jeanette? Go down a whole other rabbit hole?
And you bringing that up, Cindy, actually goes into the next potential theory, that the stalker and the killer could potentially be different people. Because in 1982, which this is another case that I would love for us to cover at some point, but there's so little information about it. But there was a case that happened in India Hills, California in 1982. So it was 2 years after Dorothy went missing. There was a 25-year-old waitress named Patricia Schneider. She left work early on the morning. So she was a waitress. So she was working probably the late shift into the early next morning on July 31st of 1982. She drove away from her job, and what the reports that I've read is that she had some level of car issues, whether her car was fully broken down or it was just having some level of mechanical issues. She stopped at a convenience store, a gas station, to try to get some help. And at that time, later on, the store clerk said that there were two people in the parking lot that were talking to her, maybe in hindsight seemed suspicious. But after that night, Patricia was never seen again, and her car was found burning intentionally. The cops deemed that it was an intentional fire that had been set, and a lot of theories link this case to Dorothy's case as well. Now, there's no reports that I found that Patricia had been receiving any kind of stalking calls or somebody harassing her leading up to her disappearance. So if Dorothy Stalker was not the killer, the same person that potentially took Patricia could be Dorothy's abductor as well. And Patricia's body has never been found.
Two quick things.
Mhm.
How far is that from where Dorothy went missing?
So I don't think it's super far location wise.
Okay, and then did Dorothy and Patricia happen to look like each other?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. But yes,
Try to connect two burning cars to each other, because how many cases have we heard of I need to get rid of the body, someone to catch on fire, or there's a barn or a house or a car. Like, everyone automatically thinks to get rid of something is to catch it on fire. If it was specific of they both had a Winnie Pooh blanket and they were both wrapped in that and then I caught it on fire, maybe. But if the only connection is a fire, I don't see the connection, because fires are in our mind, we think we're getting rid of.
But it's not just a fire. It's a person who was never seen again.
It's a person who's abducted.
Yes, I don't see that as a connection.
And they're both customer service people in some aspect. And with women, especially, you give a smile to a customer, and I've personally seen it. Men are like, "Oh, she's into me," and you're a waitress, and you say, "Not a problem, hun." "Oh, she digs me."
It is ironic, though. If they were relatively close and they're younger women, I guess Dorothy is probably older, and it would be really interesting to know if they looked alike, because if this person was fixated on the one and then she's dead now and he's not got no one to fixate, he's going to fixate on somebody else. I don't see him giving up after one. Somebody who has that mentality is going to do that again. They're going to fixate on somebody else. And it'd be really interesting to see if this other woman looked like her, just because then we can say, okay, they're relatively close.
I wish we knew if she was receiving phone calls.
Yeah.
This is a case that I would love for all of us to try to take a deep dive into, because in my cursory search of just looking up what the thoughts and theories for this case was, I came across it, but there's hardly anything about it and about her disappearance, which is just wild to me, that there's just not a lot there. And I get it's 1982, so there wasn't like the social media or the ability for everything to be put out there as much, but like Dorothy's case was at the time.
I did a quick Google search to see if Patricia and Dorothy looked alike. Thank you. Just like of a cursory glance, Patricia has blonde hair from the picture. It looks like Dorothy has dark hair, just hair-wise. But to me, they don't look exactly the same, but I'm wondering if it's more of a personality than an appearance.
And like you said, customer service.
Or just a bubbly, friendly woman. I feel like just as many cases that we hear, oh, they lit something on fire to dispose of the evidence. There's an equal amount where it's, oh, dead woman, that's weird. Another dead woman, that's crazy. Another one, I think about like the Hillside Strangler, where they're like, no, they're not connected. Oh, you need another one? They're not connected. Oh, another one. So I think it's like,
I wonder how many detectives, as they're trying to solve a crime, I wonder how many back and forth discussions that there are, like, and maybe there aren't. I don't know. I'm not a detective, but can you imagine if you're sitting and you're trying to figure out, I think it's so and so, and I think it's so and so. Could you imagine the conversations that go on in those rooms?
See, and I'm from the CSI scientific world. Just take you where the evidence goes. No speculation.
I want to ask you guys, who thinks that she was killed pretty immediately and who thinks she was not?
Actually, I'm a little in between there. I feel like would have wanted to keep her, would have abducted her and wanted to keep her. I feel like this person also might have kept some of the bones, which is why you didn't find all of them, just as like a trophy, just as now you're mine kind of thing. But when I really do think about it, I feel like this person also has an anger issue. I feel like there was jealousy involved and they probably just killed her right away instead of they wanted to keep her, but instead got just super mad at her. I also feel like maybe that the fact that they knew about the spider bite might have been her going, no, I took him to the hospital. She's trying to be like, no, nothing happened. He's my coworker. He had a spider bite, and she's trying to protect herself. And he didn't believe her. And then he accidentally, and I'm very heavily quoting, accidentally killed her. It was more like he killed her because he just couldn't control his.
And she was taking karate lessons, right? So she was most likely fighting back. So, like you said, if he was intending to keep her, thinking that she was going to be compliant and not fight back, but then if she did fight back,
he would have been following her to karate class.
He would have known.
That's true.
I think there was just this impulse rage. I think that it was a trigger after another. I think that he was triggered by seeing someone in the car. His reaction was to kidnap her, and then he was like, what the fuck do I do? And I think she was killed pretty quickly.
Yeah.
That's where I think I land as well too. If the caller, especially the caller to the newspaper, is actually her killer, the words and what he said to play off what Missy was just saying, that he saw her with another man, she's cheating on me, that he maybe confronted her about that and she said, I'm not, I was caring for him, like Missy said, and then he just got triggered at that time. I think it happened probably pretty quickly. Which a very sad point on that, which I did not raise earlier, was that the parents, the reason they kept receiving those calls, they never changed their number when they were receiving those calls, with the hope that if this person that was calling them actually had Dorothy, that they would eventually get to be able to speak with her.
That's awful that you have to make that choice. Like, I'm going to endure this on just like the 1% chance. Like, I couldn't imagine being like your gut dropping every time the phone rings.
But I think, and I could be wrong, I'm not been in that situation, we think of it as heartbreaking and devastation and depression. But I think that's almost a little bit of hope and faith of every time the phone rings of what if it is? And the last thing I can do is not change my number, because it gives that bit of hope. And I think that sometimes we just get to those places where we just need a little bit of hope. And I think that there's a lot of grasping at straws, and this was a straw that they had to grasp at to have that little bit of maybe.
And it keeps her alive in their minds, right? She's not dead. She's still alive. So as long as I'm still getting phone calls, she's still alive. And so
We
obviously,
hear people like getting abducted or from a home, and the parents will, or whoever, will stay in that home forever because
Yeah.
this is the last address they know.
This case, again, is unsolved. So maybe I know we've all kind of talked about our theories throughout, but maybe we do around the group of what everyone's final theories are. So, David, you're first on my screen. So, what do you think?
What I've said the whole episode, I think she was stalked. He was triggered. Ugly things happened. He continued to put himself into the scene of the crime.
Missy, you're next on my screen.
I'm with David. I 100% think she was stalked. I do think that it was potentially like a client or somebody that knew her from maybe the fact that her dad owned the place or at some point. I feel like the way to solve this case would have been to look at the people that either knew her dad or clients or whatever, and then also look at people that right around the time that she went missing that also went missing.
Cindy, what are your thoughts?
I agree with everyone else. It was probably just a random stalker. I like the idea of that was a customer or something like that. But you would hope that they would have looked into some of those too.
Dana, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm not going to say anything new. I think it was an acquaintance of some sort, whether it was a friend of the dad that then went to the shop and it didn't raise any suspicions. It was the sister's brother. It was some sort of person where even if she was in the back of the shop, it could be like, oh, hey, can Dorothy come out and chat? Something like that. Yeah, I'm going to echo the same thing that everybody else has said, unfortunately. I also find it interesting that when he initially called the mother, Dorothy's mom, he asked, are you related to Dorothy? Because either he's trying to confuse her, I don't know the purpose of that question, because if he didn't know her, he must have looked up the phone number in a phone book because he knew the address, if he'd been stalking her. That question specifically leads me to a lot more questions, I think, is where I'm at.
Yeah, I think that brings up a really interesting point of how he got a hold of the contact information for the parents and all of that. And that question is very just eerie. And what is the purpose of that? Are you
Right.
related to her? It just is.
And if he knew the dad, then why is he asking the mom? Yeah, so that's why I say I think it leads me just to a lot more questions that we'll just never know.
Unfortunately. Janelle, what do you think?
I think it's more with everyone else. Like this person definitely took the time this wasn't escalation. This wasn't something that just happened. This person invested. He spent a lot of time and energy on this. I think most of my questions are about the logistics of where did he go when he set that car on fire?
I think the very unfortunate part about this case, due to just the evidence that is there, the fact that it happened 1980, 1984, they were able to identify her skeletal remains. There's no way now, I don't think, to really figure out, unless somebody comes forward and says something, who was making those calls to Dorothy, who was making the calls to the parents. There's just not going to be any good answers. With that being said, if anyone listening has any information about Dorothy's disappearance or about her murder, they can contact the Orange County Sheriff's Department at 714-647-7000. And that's 714-647-7000. And I really hope that someday this case will be solved. Unfortunately, both of Dorothy's parents are now deceased, but I do believe that her son is still alive, and I really do hope that this family really at some point gets answers about what happened to Dorothy. But thank you everyone for joining and speculating with us tonight.
We don't want you to miss any of our future recordings. Please take this time now to subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can find us also on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or TikTok at SWACPod. That's SWACPOD. Or you can contact us via email for any questions, comments, or case ideas at swacpod@gmail.com. Thank you for speculating wildly with us tonight.